Is this recording? All right. All right. So I was thinking that, okay, last class, I was tickled by something. And I realized it's a really weird thing to say. I was tickled by something I said. By the way, it's not always a good thing when you're tickled. You don't always feel good when you're tickled. And in this case, it made me feel really upset. I hated myself. And I hated myself for saying something so stupid at what I said at the end of my lecture. But the great thing about hatred is that it functioned in such a way that it put me to work for this week. And I'm not sure you're going to see the consequences of the fruits of my labor. But anyway, it concerned this final sentence that I quoted in my lecture last week about lawlessness arising from our exploration of the Lacanian concept of existence. Existence. To exit the world, it doesn't mean that the accidents stop repeating. Lacan invoked this concept of existence to point at a repetition that occurs outside of the context of a shared world, which means that there's something ungovernable in that world, something not under its laws, and so it cannot be tamed. So you cannot reason with what exists. And it forced me to reflect upon this political orientation, and this is partly why I hated myself, that I thought I abandoned a long, long time ago, namely anarchism. Immediately, you might presume that anarchists made lawlessness the cornerstone of their political orientation or the political discourse, but in fact, I would say it's not true. The anarchists cared a lot about laws. They were oriented by the law, whether by revolting against the law, as I think Julie was pointing at a little bit in her lecture, or in their celebration of the laws of nature, of science, of evolution. I remember this orientation because I remember looking through the black holes of my balaclava, staring at taser guns that were pointed right at me by the line of police that were lined up in front of me, the riot police and the riot gear. In one of my hands, I had a bag filled with handmade paint bombs, which were cobbled together using paint, old burnt out light bulbs and candle wax. And in my other hand, I had a large jug of petrol, which I poured onto the walls before lighting them on fire. And I was thinking it's a miracle I never set myself on fire. But by the way, my comrade suffered burns on his arm, which are still with him today. His whole arm is burned. But it reminds you that when you set the world on fire, you run the risk of being engulfed in a blaze of petrol. So I somehow managed to avoid setting myself on fire during that period of my life. And it was probably because, in retrospect, I found the university, which promptly offered its walls to me for use. And I wandered those walls for 20 years, doing my time. Having now made it to the other side, I would say that I feel a little bit like a monk wandering without a temple. And maybe one day I might set myself on fire in protest against the university. That's why it's important for me not to be without a school, with a capital S, school as a concept, because a school can provide walls which can be put to use. I didn't say that I wouldn't be without a university, because in the psychoanalytic sense, a university and a school are not the same thing. They're two different things. A university is usually populated by idiots. I know that's really arrogant. But a school nourishes stupidity. Again, I'm not trying to be disrespectful. I'm even willing to admit, for example, that like I have dreams of one day after I do my time, I'll become like recognized in the university. I'll be a professor idiotus or something like that. After more than 20 years of wandering the halls of this temple, the university halls, I feel like I've earned the privilege, maybe you haven't yet, I've earned the privilege of saying shit like this without consequence. But if the university saved me from setting myself on fire, then psychoanalysis also saved me from setting myself on fire from the university. I was thinking about how the university was always a prison. You know, it upholds a world for itself under constant pressure from the outside. For example, Western liberal arts universities, they're now struggling to survive because they've set their own walls on fire. You know, for several decades, maybe since the 1950s or 60s, they've mistook petrol for walls. What I mean is that the university builds itself using flammable material for walls. It integrates, okay, I'm using a bad analogy, it integrates precisely that which it rejects. That which most threatens the university, it incorporates into the university. Intellectual, artistic, political movements, many of which are explicitly anti-university, are the very stuff of a liberal arts education. You're taught how to read Frantz Fanon, radical anti-colonial psychoanalytic thinker, revolutionary thinker. You're taught to read Frantz Fanon's stumbling words, his ellipses. He doesn't know how to speak. He says so himself. He doesn't know how to speak well. They're transcribing his words from a hospital bed, including the docs, because he's silent and he can't find his words. But you're taught to study it in such a way so that you yourself do not stumble. It's a paradox, and it has serious consequences for public intellectuals, for people like Julie and I. We're now witnessing the quick demise of the public intellectual. The institution is forcing a retreat into its walls. Scholars now have to choose between petrol or walls. And I think it's even more true today. As a scholar, you have to ensure that your discussions occur within Q1 or Q2 academic journals, rather than within the wider discussion. It's not that the wider discussions are prohibited. You're perfectly permitted to speak in the big magazines, in the newspapers, on the blogs, on your Facebook wall. You're totally free to do that. But they've made it impossible from the very beginning to do both. Cornel West, I call him Brother Cornel West. Cornel West, I hope you know who he is. He's one of America's most important public intellectuals. He was recently denied tenure at Princeton University. For this reason, Slavoj Zizek, he never had tenure in the university. All my heroes never had tenure in the university, and yet they're associated somehow with the university. I hesitate to mention Jordan Peterson, his recent retreat from the university. The trend suggests that universities are aiming to eliminate public discourse to defend against their own irrelevance, the institution's irrelevance. They want to fortify the walls. The irony is that public intellectuals used to be an insurance policy against fire. They fought fire with fire. They were setting the world on fire until eventually the university itself got burned by the fires that it set, by woke culture, by radical social movements, and so on. Anyway, here's the point. The university never had a world in the first place. If you think that the essential function of the university is to educate, then you're wrong. That's not its purpose. The university has as its most central function to simply uphold a world for itself. It simply wants to exist and to continue to exist. And to do that, it has to, its pillars have to be kept from being destroyed. Its walls, its pillars, the pillars of its temple. And that requires that you populate the field with idiots, by those who do not see the prison within which they earn their degrees. They teach, they mentor, and they do research, and they study. But I'm not only speaking about the university as an institution. What Lacan called university discourse, It's simply another word for a strategy of upholding a world for oneself. A strategy that functions in many other places other than the university, and some might say it doesn't even function in the university anymore. So you can see, for example, how the American prison system functions like a university through its routine, its bureaucracy, and so on. I mean, inmates now earn degrees from reputable universities at an unprecedented rate. The American revolutionary Malcolm X was apparently radicalized and educated in the prison, where he also discovered his temple, Islam. Lacan saw the university discourse as most operative in the Soviet Union. For him, it was the exemplary case of university discourse. You would have to be pressed to find a social bond as large, as impactful, and as extensive as the Soviet Union for your example of university discourse. For Lacan, the Soviet Union had the structure of the university. He said it explicitly. He was once provoked by a student during one of his talks. The student insisted that Lacan leave the lecture hall. He wasn't a professor, but he was at a lecture hall. And he insisted that Lacan join the communist revolution that was happening outside. Lacan responded in the following way, I quote him: "The configuration of workers' peasants has nevertheless led to a form of society in which it is precisely the university that occupies the driving seat. For what reigns in what is commonly called the Soviet Union of Socialist Republics is the university," end quote. I get thirsty when I talk. I also get really emotional. I feel it. So what's at stake in the university discourse when it comes to love? Well, in university discourse, we can't say that love is devotion, at least not in the way that I described in my previous lectures, or my second lecture. How can you fall in love if love was never part of your plan? For the university, love is precisely always part of the plan. You plan to fall in love. That's why it never happens in the university. I can imagine that love will be more and more a favored topic in the university as the institution fortifies its walls more and more with fire. Love in the Soviet Union was always a part of the plan. And it was taught to the Red Sparrows, for example, if you're familiar with the Red Sparrows, for the purposes of advancing the interests of the Soviet Empire. These schools still exist in Russia. They're privatized mostly, but they still exist long after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Schools that teach you how to fall in love. They're schools that teach young women how to seduce men, and how to make the right type of men, maybe an influential one or a wealthy one, fall in love with you. The university loves checkboxes, and each box, that's a euphemism, each box must be checked. It's a process that involves ensuring that your papers and your passport are in the proper order. But it's not only the discourse that's found in the Soviet Union, it's also found in the governments of Western countries. Absolutely. I know this more than ever right now, trying to talk to the Canadian government. You can find it in all kinds of places. I remember telling you a few weeks ago, maybe it was in the seminar of a friend of mine outside of Toronto, who insisted that his partner must already have a career, be of a particular religious persuasion, a particular height, listen to the right type of music, and all this other stuff before he will even consider her as date material. These are checkboxes that must be checked. And he rejected women, and women rejected him. Ultimately, it's an assurance policy that one imagines will promise that it will keep the fires of passion burning long into the night for years and years into the future. Insurance that the walls of the relationship will hold for many, many years. Yet it assures you of nothing except that contingencies are inevitable and that whatever you do, you will not be prepared for them. That's why professors still fall in love. You do hear about it every now and then, but it's very rare. And it even surprises people. And sometimes professors fall in love with their students, God forbid. It's outlawed, it's considered immoral, but the practice continues, and it continues in secret. And when it hits the social media or the newspapers, then the political movements take over. The psychoanalytic clinic does not necessarily try to reject that type of love. Love that occurs, in a situation of like a power indifference or something like that, whether between a professor and a student, or between professors and other professors of different salaries and ranks, or even between a psychoanalyst and a patient. They don't reject that like the university does. Psychoanalysis views it as what they call transference, which is, it's the sort of love, transference love, it's the pivot around which all psychoanalytic work revolves. The whole world is built, the whole psychoanalytic world is built around that type of love. It was even fashionable for a really long time to claim that there's no treatment, let's call it psychoanalytic training or education, without that type of love between the patient and the psychoanalyst. Even if it's negative transference, which means hatred of your psychoanalyst as your teacher. And the negative transference gets you to work. It's even why Lacan claimed he had negative transference, which means he hated Freud. He had negative transference to Freud. He hated Freud in this sense. Jacques-Alain Miller even said that positive transference is bad because it doesn't get you to work. You love your psychoanalyst, you don't get to work. You love the person you're studying, it doesn't put you to work. But the negative forces to say, force you to say something like, okay, I know Freud wrote this, but why did he write it? And then you get to work. You're in a disagreement with Freud. You need to know why. Or it can lead you to say, I know Jacques-Alain Miller spoke about lawlessness and it makes me think of anarchism, but why? Which is where I am. What's fascinating to me is that the Soviet Union was said to have outlawed sex. We all know this expression. There's no sex in the Soviet Union, and we all know it's not true. It seems rather that what was outlawed was love. Anybody who would live through the Soviet Union will tell you this idea that there's no sex and that it's bullshit. I heard it from people here. I used to believe it until I came here and I heard other people tell me this is bullshit. But it's love that was outlawed. Marriage took a major hit in the Soviet Union. The divorce rates, particularly in the major cities, the university cities in Moscow, in Leningrad, and so on, the divorce rates skyrocketed. But the practice of marriage nonetheless persisted in the rural areas where something remained of the practice of love and marriage. It continued precisely as this remainder, this residue, which the law could not incorporate, could not imprison within the walls, something that the laws could not govern. Okay, I admit many of you can probably teach me more about this than I can teach you. I'm being mostly rhetorical. Maybe you can do that in the seminar. And I know many of you were born, well, some of you, I don't know, were born in the Soviet Union. Some of you experienced it and its dissolution. I know Julie has. She was, of course, living in Ukraine when the Soviet Union dissolved, right? Okay, so my claim, which is not that controversial, is that the discourse that sustained the Soviet Union has not dissolved. I'm still asked for my passport for simple tasks, and to fill in paperwork for minute things like, did you come to professor in the box or did you not? And for what reason? The type of love that psychoanalysts call transference, positive transference, which is fake love, fraudulent love for psychoanalysts, it exists within the university. But nobody admits that it exists except as some sort of scandal or tragedy. Precisely because we do not expect love to exist within the university unless it follows the proper procedures and passes through the scrutiny of documents and human resource offices and so on. But it's different in the psychoanalytic clinic. Beyond transference love, there's also a love which exists exis, which occurs outside of the laws of the world. It's a love that exists when the walls of the world come crashing down. In the Western world, those laws have already come crashing down, and what remains of love is hatred and immolation. The other day, I was reading a story on Facebook from, I'm not going to say who, and there's no way this person will ever know that I'm talking about them because I have 5,000 friends. It was a woman on Facebook who was at a shop in an American city, major American city, and she explained in her post that a worker asked her out on a date. These were the only details that were provided. She was asked out on a date. Her immediate conclusion was that it was abuse. And she immediately received a surplus of comments of support for the abuse that she incurred by being asked out on a date. Maybe she did experience that as abuse, and maybe there is something more to it than that. I don't know. I'm not trying to laugh or mock or say she's wrong or it didn't happen. But for me, I can think of nothing more gentleman-like than a pathetic man asking a woman out on a date, a pathetic working class man asking a woman out on a date, which doesn't mean that I don't understand why some people scream and cry like the world is crashing down when somebody does ask them out on a date. The universities didn't realize that they were fortifying their walls with fire, and neither did the Western world. You know, a statue in New York reads, "Give us your poor, you're tired, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." They're basically saying, give us all the rejects of the social bond, everything that's rejected, all the remainders. And we want to incorporate them into this prior unity, the social consistency we call the states that are united. I remember when I discovered that the university was a prison. I remember it really well. At the time, I was reading Frantz Fanon, who was stammering. I was reading the work of Slavoj Zizek. I was reading Judith Butler and many others. I remember Frantz Fanon. I remember the preface to one of his books, which was dictated from a hospital bed. He said, I must speak, even though I don't know what to say or how to say it. Despite my inability to do it, I must speak. It was idiosyncratic. I didn't say idiosyncratic. It was idiosyncratic, but my university taught me not to be idiosyncratic, not to appreciate the style of the people we were reading. If I wrote or spoke like Frantz Fanon wrote or spoke, or Nietzsche or Deleuze or Slavoj Zizek or any one of my heroes, I would not have gotten a PhD. They didn't pass peer reviews. Nietzsche didn't pass a peer review. He wasn't publishing in a Scopus indexed Q1 or Q2 journal and so on. I can't imagine Nietzsche submitting his work for peer review in a Q1 journal. Lacan, who scholars study in the university throughout the world, he never held the title of a tenured professor, emeritus. And it's nothing new. George Simmel, to take another one of my heroes at random, sociologist from Germany. He's today a central sociologist. Everybody studies him as canonical. It's a new development, I admit, but he spent his life trying to obtain a position in the university. He was rejected. The university has a knack for integrating, incorporating into their consistency precisely that which they nonetheless reject. It's a dangerous game when you do that. You're playing with fire. Why don't they ever admit that to themselves? The university is an assault upon what exists, what cannot be governed. It's an assault upon style. We're taught to never embrace our style, our idiosyncrasies. Instead, we have to come to know them as an object of study and imagine that we can share some knowledge of this as an object of study in some sort of a shared world with one another. We can understand Fanon's inability to speak. I remember when the walls came crashing down for me in the university. I sold everything I owned. I went to Switzerland. I was ready to drop out of a PhD program because I was giving up on the university. My supervisor claimed he couldn't supervise my dissertation. because it wasn't Freudian enough, and I was doing a disservice to the Freudian project. Now I'm called too Freudian, which is funny. And he wouldn't sit on my PhD committee anymore. He was teaching me about Zizek. And when I was ready to give up, I went to Switzerland, and I was sitting there having breakfast with the person I was reading, Zizek. And we were discussing anarchism, Zizek and I. And as we were chatting, he was eating a hard-boiled egg, and he was spitting pieces of it. It was hitting me in the face. Some was falling into my coffee. And I'm not saying that to make fun of him. I respect him for that. It's an interesting style. It's admiration for Zizek. It wasn't an acorn that hit me on the head. It was a chunk of a hard-boiled egg. Something hit me though. And I suddenly realized that it was more important to meet Slavoj and to talk to him, to bullshit with him, than it was to read something from a textbook at my university about him. I suddenly confronted in Switzerland the movement of thinking. But it meant that my world was on fire again. I didn't believe in the university and its world anymore. And where did it lead me? It led me to a long period of silence, precisely on the topic of anarchism. I stopped writing and speaking about anarchism. I didn't know how to talk about anarchism anymore. And I realized that the period of my silence corresponded to the period of my sustained engagement with psychoanalysis. It was a period of a deepened devotion to the teachings of Jacques Lacan, and more specifically to the concept of the real with a capital R. Shit. The real, when it's all said and done, the real is without law. It's the best definition we can have of the real. And it was the definition that was highlighted by Jacques-Alain Miller as being central to the teaching of Jacques Lacan, particularly the late teaching of Jacques Lacan, when Miller said that Lacan can offer us a real for the 21st century. That's how he put it, a real for the 21st century. So for that reason, I don't think I was really within a long period of silence about anarchism, or that psychoanalysis somehow substituted my devotion to anarchism for a devotion to psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis was a consequence of my devotion to anarchism. It was its continuation by other means, the possibility of its continuation after the fire burns the walls and the world to the ground. You still need a wall to make use of, to sustain a world for yourself outside of the law. Each of the Abrahamic religions, for example, makes use of a wall without realizing it. They call it the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, the Weeping Wall, how do you call it? Barak Wall, and so on. When the temple comes crashing down, you still need a wall to lean on. And I'm convinced that anybody devoted to anarchism will be led toward psychoanalysis. Very few anarchists will agree with me on that. Provided they do not conflate anarchism with political discourse or with university discourse. What Karl Marx and his followers discovered about anarchists was that they can be a bit idiotic. By the way, the only place you will find anarchists these days, for the most part, at least in the Western world, is in the university, where anarchist studies departments populate the university, and where you will find a surplus of anarchist scholars. But I claim that anarchism is not necessarily always political. There's many anarchists who have later become, who spoke about anarchism without politics. Max Stirner, for example. He made a distinction between what he called political revolution and personal insurrection. Political revolution aims toward new arrangements in the world, he said. Personal insurrection leads us to no longer allow ourselves to be arranged by the world. It's an important difference. It's a statement against idiocy or idiotology. What the concept of the school offers, with a capital S, and I'm coming to the end, are walls that we can make use of so that we don't set ourselves on fire. And yet at the same time, these are not walls that are imposed upon us by force, as they are in a prison. I find myself defending this concept that I hopefully will try and develop a bit more in future lectures, we'll see, on the school. I defend it as put forward by Jacques Lacan and worked through by Jacques-Alain Miller, because anarchism is nothing without a social bond. You know, this anarchist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, I don't know if you've heard of him, Proudhon. But Lacan, by the way, mentioned him a few times in passing, and it's interesting that each time Lacan mentioned Proudhon, it was always in admiration, and it was usually regarding Proudhon's discussions of marriage. Proudhon claimed that anarchy is order. Anarchy is order without power. It's a paradoxical claim because it's not how we imagine anarchy. It's order. That's why the people claim the graffiti is an A inside of an O for order. Anarchy is order, but without power, which means without the law. At the end of a psychoanalysis, when the world ceases to exist, you have to avoid setting yourself on fire. And as I see it, the school is a protection against that possibility. And maybe there's other protections, but for me, it's my protection. In this sense, the school, the psychoanalytic school, is an anarchist social bond. It's not a weeping wall where you cry about the world that you lost, as in certain forms of maybe mourning, melancholia. But it occurs during a period of melancholia at the end as the means through which you have the support of a world without idiocy, without the law. I'll stop there. We have 5 minutes, I think. We have 6 minutes. Should we just go? Can we just go? Is it okay? And we'll see you during seminars. Stay safe. Bye.